It is one of the most important mountain ranges in Middle-earth, a place that would see dwarven civilizations rise and fall and rise again. Through centuries marked by war and the destruction of part of the mountain range itself, it would time and again become a place of vital importance for the dwarves. Today on Nerd of the Rings, we cover the history of the Blue Mountains. In the shaping of Middle-earth, we learn the origin of the Ered Luin, or Blue Mountains. After Melkor destroys the two lamps, the Valar travel west to make their new home of Valinor. In an effort to protect Valinor from attack, they thrust Middle-earth farther away from their new land. As a result, 4 ranges of mountains are formed in Middle-earth, including the Blue Mountains. During their days in Valinor, the Vala Aule would travel to the darkness of Middle-earth, where he would create the 7 fathers of the dwarves and their spouses. After being confronted by Ilúvatar, Aule would be made to set his children to sleep beneath the various mountains of the world. 2 of these couples Aule would place in the Blue Mountains. These dwarves, known as the Broadbeams and Firebeards, would be the westernmost of all clans of the dwarves, and the only dwarves to take part in the events of the First Age. Sometime after the awakening of the elves in the year of the trees 1050, the dwarves scattered across Middle-earth would wake in their mountain homes. The Firebeards and Broadbeams would found 2 great dwarf cities within the Blue Mountains, Belegost to the north and Nogrod to the south. In the year of the trees 1250, these dwarves would first enter the lands of Beleriand and meet the Sindarin elves. Together, the elves and the dwarves of Belegost would build the city of Menegroth in King Thingol's realm of Doriath. Menegroth would be remembered as a remarkable underground fortress. Indeed, its very name means 1,000 caves. In exchange for their help, the dwarves are rewarded with knowledge from Melian, as well as the great pearl Nymphelos, which the chieftain of the dwarves prized above a mountain of wealth. This was good, as the dwarves, though unwearied and eager for new works, were known to expect payment for their toil. In the First Age, we find both Nogrod and Belegost would trade with the elves, specifically the Sindarin elves of Doriath. They would even have a road made as a route for this trade. Simply known as the Dwarf Road, it would run from the mountains between the 2 cities, west along the north of the Asgar River, before crossing the Gelion at Sarn Athrad. Though they are often referred to together, the dwarves of Nogrod and Belegost have quite different reputations and histories. Nogrod, which translates to hollow delving, is particularly known for its craftsmanship, having some of the greatest smiths of the First Age. One such smith is Gamel Zarak, whose work was said to be well represented in the treasuries of Thingol. Zirak the Old's student was Telkar, who would eclipse his master in achievement. Telkar would forge the knife Angrist, which Beren would use to pry a Silmaril from Morgoth's iron crown. He would also create the famed Dragon-helm of Dor-lomin and the sword Narsil, the very blade used by Elendil of Númenor and later reforged for Aragorn. Meanwhile, when it came to Belegost, which means Great Fortress, it is known to typically have better relations with the elves, and the divide between such relations would only become greater with dark deeds to come. The dwarves of Belegost would not only be friendly with the Sindar, but also the Noldor, whom they first meet when the sons of Feanor and their people come to Mount Rerir. Indeed, it was another of the Noldor that the dwarves of Belegost, and possibly those of Nogrod, would assist in the building of a new realm in 102 of the First Age. This elf was none other than Galadriel's brother, Finrod. In the Silmarillion, we are told In that labor, Finrod was aided by the dwarves of the Blue Mountains, and they were rewarded well, for Finrod had brought more treasures out of Tirion than any other of the princes of the Noldor. And in that time was made for him the Nauglamir, the necklace of the dwarves, most renowned of their works in the elder days. Not only did the dwarves of the Blue Mountains get great riches for their work in delving yet another great elven city, but they also gave to Finrod a masterwork of their race, the Nauglamir. Finrod would also receive a new name from the dwarves, leading him to be called Felagund, meaning maker of caves. When it comes to these First Age dwarves, there are very few known by name. Aside from the great smiths of Nogrod, the most notable is Azagal, who was the lord of Belegost. One day, while traveling on the dwarf road in East Beleriand, Azagal is attacked by orcs. Fortunately, he is aided by Maithros, the eldest son of Feanor. For his help, Azagal gives to Maithros a great helm, none other than the Dragon-helm made by Telkar. Azagal and the Belegost dwarves would remain allies of the Noldor, and in 468, he would join the Union of Maithros. This alliance is organized by the sons of Feanor to make a great war upon Morgoth, and features elves and men from across the lands of Beleriand. 4 years later, when the battle is fought, the dwarves would take part in the Eastern campaign, joining the elves and Easterlings. While some of the Easterlings would betray the army, the dwarves would remain fiercely loyal to Maithros. As the battle becomes a disaster, Azagal and his people aid the elves in their retreat, standing firm against the very worst of Morgoth's forces, the dragon Glaurung. Last of all the eastern force to stand firm were the dwarves of Belegost, and thus they won renown, for the Naugrim withstood fire more heartily than either elves or men, and it was their custom moreover to wear great masks in battle, hideous to look upon, and those stood them in good stead against the dragons. And but for them, Glaurung and his brood would have withered all that was left of the Noldor. But the Naugrim made a circle about him when he assailed them, and even his mighty armor was not foolproof against the blows of their great axes. And when in his rage Glaurung turned and struck down Azagal, lord of Belegost, and crawled over him, with his last stroke Azagal drove a knife into his belly, and so wounded him that he fled the field, and the beasts of Angband in dismay followed after him. Then the dwarves raised up the body of Azagal and bore it away, and with slow steps they walked behind, singing a dirge in deep voices, as it were a funeral pomp in their country, and gave no heed more to their foes, and none dared to stay them. While the dwarves of Belegost would be remembered for their incredible bravery, the dwarves of Nogrod would soon become infamous among the Sindar. Years before the disastrous battle which saw Azagal fall, Beren and Luthien had succeeded in stealing a Silmaril. This great jewel had been delivered to King Thingol of Doriath. Thingol then seeks out the very craftsmen who aided in creating his great city, the dwarves of Nogrod. He tasks the dwarves with combining the Silmaril with a wondrous necklace of countless gems, the Nauglamir. This great necklace, made by the dwarves' own hands, was brought out of the ruins of Nargothrond to Thingol. The dwarves, like Thingol himself, become enamored of the beauty of these pieces. They succeed in combining them into a wondrous necklace, but refuse to give it to Thingol, instead declaring that the Elf King had no right to the Nauglamir, for it had been made for Finrod alone and had been stolen from Nargothrond. Thingol responds in anger. "How dare ye of uncouth race dare to demand aught of me, Elu Thingol, Lord of Beleriand, whose life began by the waters of Cuiviénen years uncounted ere the fathers of the stunted people awoke? and standing tall and proud among them, he bade them with shameful words be gone unrequited out of Doriath. The lust of the dwarves is then kindled into a rage by the words of Thingol, and they slew the king where he stood. Making off with the prize Nauglamir, the dwarves flee eastward, but are pursued and killed by the elves of Doriath. The Nauglamir is returned to Menegroth, while 2 surviving dwarves return home to Nogrod. There the dwarves weave a tale of the elven king cheating them of payment and ordering them killed. Nogrod gathers a great host and sends word to Belegost, asking them to join. Belegost refuses. Thus the host of Nogrod marches alone into Doriath to the very caves of Menegroth. Both elves and dwarves would suffer heavy losses in the battle in the 1,000 caves. Ultimately, the Nauglamir would be taken by the dwarves, and one of the elves' greatest warriors, Mablung of the Heavy Hand, would be slain. As the dwarves make their way back to Nogrod with great treasures taken from Menegroth, word comes to Beren, who travels north with a company of green elves, ambushing the dwarves near Sarn Athrad. Once again, there are surviving dwarves who make their way east in hopes of escape. These hopes are quickly dashed as they climb the slopes of Mount Dolmed, where a group of Ents drive the dwarves into the forest, where all would perish. As he lay dying, the Lord of Nogrod curses the treasure of Doriath. Thus Beren casts all the treasure into the Askar River, all save the Nauglamir. This necklace would for a time be worn upon the neck of Luthien, and would later bring much pain and death to the elves in tales told elsewhere. As for the dwarves of the Blue Mountains, the next we hear of them comes in the devastation of the War of Wrath. As Beleriand is nearly completely destroyed, we are told that both dwarven cities of Nogrod and Belegost are ruined in the tumult. As a result, roughly 40 years into the Second Age, we are told the surviving dwarves would make their way eastward, joining with the Longbeards of Khazad-dûm. Thus, 3 clans of the dwarves would dwell in this greatest of dwarven realms, leading Khazad-dûm to its pinnacle. For the dwarves of Nogrod and Belegost would bring with them lore and craft they had both discovered for themselves and learned from the elves. Still, it would seem the dwarves did not completely abandon the Blue Mountains, for we are told in the appendices of The Lord of the Rings that dwarves still dwelt in the eastern side of the Blue Mountains, especially south of the Gulf of Luin. These settlements had mines, and the dwarves would often traverse the road through Arnor, no doubt going to their kin in the Misty Mountains. As for the northern part of the Blue Mountains, we are told that the last king of Arnor, Arvedui, would hide in the old dwarf mines prior to his death in the Ice Bay. It is likely these were indeed abandoned mines, as Arvedui is eventually forced north out of hunger, seeming to indicate there were no dwarves in these northern mines. The next and perhaps most well-known of the events in the Blue Mountains would come late in the Third Age. Over centuries, the dwarves of Khazad-dûm would be displaced time and again, first by the Balrog in Moria, then by dragons in the Grey Mountains, then by Smaug in Erebor. It is the last of these which lead Durin's folk to temporarily settle in the lands of Dunland. After a war of vengeance against the orcs of the Misty Mountains, King Thrain would lead his people to the Blue Mountains in 2802, becoming the first kingdom in the Blue Mountains for over 6,200 years. Notably, this would mean that very few dwarves would live in the Blue Mountains during the time an elven realm existed around them. For the duration of the Second Age, the kingdom of Lindon would be a vital location for the Free Peoples. But by the time Thrain re-establishes a major settlement in the Ered Luin, Lindon has been reduced to a small realm of elves at the Grey Havens. For 39 years, Thrain would rule his people in the Blue Mountains, before he leaves with a company determined to return to Erebor. On this journey, the king would go missing, captured and imprisoned in Sauron's fortress of Dol Guldur. The kingship passes to his son, Thorin Oakenshield. Under Thorin's rule, the dwarves of the Blue Mountains would prosper, yet the years lengthened. The embers in the heart of Thorin grew hot again, as he brooded on the wrongs of his house and of the vengeance upon the dragon that was bequeathed to him. He thought of weapons and armies and alliances, and his great hammer rang in the forge. But the armies were dispersed and the alliances broken, and the axes of his people were few, and a great anger without hope burned him, as he smote the red iron on the anvil. One day, as he is traveling west back to his home in the Blue Mountains, Thorin has a chance meeting with Gandalf the Grey at the Prancing Pony in Bree. This meeting, taking place on March 15th, 2941, would lay the foundation for their great quest. The two agree to travel together, with Thorin saying to the wizard, "I have much on my mind, and they say you are wise and know more than most of what goes on in the world. Will you come home with me and hear me and give me your counsel?" To this Gandalf agreed, and when they came to Thorin's hall, he sat long with him and heard all the tale of his wrongs. From Thorin, Gandalf would learn of the king's grand plans of battle and war against the dragon. Knowing this to be a fool's errand, Gandalf leaves and travels to the Shire, where he checks in on a hobbit he remembered from years past, Bilbo Baggins, who was now known for going off for days at a time and could be seen talking to strangers, even dwarves. After a brief encounter where Bilbo talks of trying to go see elves, an inspired Gandalf returns to Thorin, hoping to convince him to abandon plans for war in favor of secrecy. Ultimately, it is the map and key Gandalf had received from Thrain that convinced Thorin to go through with Gandalf's strategy. Thus, after nearly 100 years of rule in the Blue Mountains, Thorin would finally set out to take Erebor back from Smaug. While Thorin himself would fall in battle, Erebor was ultimately reclaimed, and Thorin's cousin, Dane Ironfoot, ascends to the throne. The Lonely Mountain once again becomes the capital of Durin's folk, and while it is believed many dwarves of the Blue Mountains would relocate to Erebor, some of their people would continue to dwell in Thorin's Hall in the Blue Mountains. It would seemingly continue to operate as a settlement under the greater rule of Erebor. We are told that dwarves would travel the east-west road through the Shire to go back and forth to the mines of the Blue Mountains. By the time of The Lord of the Rings, these dwarves were said to have been the hobbits' chief source of news from distant parts, if they wanted any, of course. For as a rule, dwarves said little, and hobbits asked no more. As far as their trade habits, we don't get a complete picture, though dwarves may very well have traded with the men of Bree, and even traveled with goods onward to Erebor. Not only were these dwarves known for the riches they mined and their smithy work, but during the glory days of Erebor, their toy market in Dale was a wonder to behold. Closer to the Blue Mountains, however, we are told in the prologue of The Lord of the Rings that the hobbits of the East Farthing would wear dwarf boots in muddy weather. Interestingly, there are also 3 dwarves who help Bilbo Baggins move from Bag End when he leaves for Rivendell. As they are unnamed in the final text, it is unlikely they were among the original company of Thorin Oakenshield. In an earlier version of the text, there were actually 4 dwarves aiding him, and their names are listed as Nar, Anar, Lofar, and Hanar. We cannot say for certain, but it's possible these dwarves were either from the Blue Mountains or from Erebor. In the days leading up to the War of the Ring, Frodo Baggins was said to have often met dwarves from far countries, seeking refuge in the West. This refers to the 4 clans of the dwarves who lived in the lands of Rhûn, for they spoke of the enemy and the land of Mordor. And it is likely that these dwarves would join with Durin's folk in the Blue Mountains. If this is indeed the case, it is possible that the Ered Luin would ultimately be home to dwarves descending from all 7 of the great clans. While much would change after Sauron's defeat, including another new realm founded by Gimli, dwarves would continue to dwell in the east side of the Blue Mountains as they had for the previous 2 centuries. Through both friendship and bloodshed with elves, destruction, refounding, and amidst the rise and fall of other dwarven lands, the Blue Mountains would remain a place for the dwarves of Middle-earth to call home. As always, I want to say a huge thank you to all my Patreon and YouTube supporters who make this channel possible. Tom DeBombadil19, Lissamy the Cinda, Rabbi Rob Thomas, Charles Leisure, CCDC Red Team, Joe Tepper, The Mighty Mim, Andrew Carlisle, Swirled Traveler, Matthew Jeffrey, Viking Lord, Alvin Einbert, Jeremy Daniel Derby, Madame Director, Leo Vittori, Sky Carcass, Slide Belts, Dane Ragnarsson, Berto Berg, Graham Darracott, The Dark-Haired One, Wyland, Z and N, Evely, Micah Wu, and Debbie. If you enjoyed the artwork in this video, check out the artists in the description to purchase prints of their great work for yourself. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time on Nerd of the Rings.